Okay, good morning. Thank you so much for coming to this How to Work with Adjacent Open Source Community panel. And throughout this whole conference, I'm sure you have been hearing a lot about open infrastructure, especially Red Hat, your keynote, Mark, you talked about open infrastructure. So yeah, we're all very excited about this movement. And as you know, that as we are moving towards more and more, the innovation part, the 5G, the AI and container world, and OpenStack can no longer just stand alone by itself. We need to work well with communities. And however, there are a lot of challenges. So at this panel, we'd like to talk about these challenges and then see how we can all get together and find solutions. And I don't have a lot of questions, so I'm going to rely on you guys to also ask some questions too. So make sure that you use the mics. All right, let me introduce myself. My name is Annie Lai. I work for Huawei, and I also sit on OpenStack board and CNCF board. So I have my challenges working across communities too, but I can share with you later. And here I'd like to introduce our panel. Chris, the gentleman sitting over there, Chris works for Ericsson, and Chris currently sits on OpenStack board as well as OpenNFV board. And, I'm so sorry, but you're still very active there. You know what? I better let you guys introduce yourself because I'll be making mistakes. Okay, Dims. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry, Chris. Would you like to continue?
Okay, sure. So my name's Christopher Price. I'm, as mentioned, part of the OpenStack board. Also a member of the Linux Foundation board. I work for Ericsson, essentially in a small activity we have called Ericsson Software Technology, which is very much focused on cross-community competence and collaboration in open source.
Hi, my nickname is Dims. My real name is longer, of course.
How do you say it? I've never heard you say that. What's your official name?
We'll do that later.
Okay.
So I work in OpenStack and in Kubernetes communities. Well, one of the things that I was trying to do was how do we make things better between the two communities over a period of time. So I've been spending a lot of time actually doing hands-on work in both communities. So I have some stories to tell. Kandan?
This is Kandan Kadriwal from AT&T. I represent AT&T in the OpenStack board. I've been quite involved, and my team is also quite involved in the many open source forum, that including OpenStack. And currently, very focused on getting the Akraino kickstarted. And we have been having a lot of good sessions about Akraino. And AT&T has been quite involved in many open sources. And right now, we are really focused on 4 key areas of open source. One is ONAP, and second one is Danas, and third one is Akamose, and the fourth one is Akraino, including all other open source areas that we have been involved on, that including standard bodies, that including OpenStack. And currently we are trying to focus on these 4 areas to really get the community going.
Hey, I'm Mark McLaughlin. I'm a long-time Red Hatter and open source contributor. I've been at Red Hat 15 years and working on open source longer than that. I used to be a contributor to the OpenStack project, pretty heavy contributor to the OpenStack project, and was on the technical committee. These days I run OpenStack, or Red Hat's large OpenStack engineering team. So a lot of my work is now kind of behind the scenes at Red Hat, but I do represent Red Hat on the OpenStack Foundation board as well.
Great. And like I said, I work for Huawei, and open source is very big for us. So we have invested heavily in various open source projects, ranging from obviously OpenStack, Linux Foundation, under Linux Foundation, ONAP, CNCF, and Apache, etc. So we got our open source teams working all over these open source projects. So we definitely have a lot of things that, experiences that we can share with you. So, okay, my first question for the panel is, so let's just talk about challenges first. From your experience, what are the challenges, working across communities? Who would like to start?
I can start. So I won't call it a problem. It's kind of like challenges. So it's finding people, right? Finding people who are similar to the way you think, finding people who can help you with your work, building bridges between the two communities. Like, for example, if you're working in Nova in OpenStack, Then you can go to Signode, which is kind of like equivalent because it's compute in Kubernetes. So, and then you can find some like-minded people who are working on similar problems. So you have to like kind of like figure out. You have to listen. You have to watch. You have to observe how in other communities. When you go to other communities, you have to like listen and watch and observe and see how they work, what they are doing, and how they make decisions and things like that. And then you get comfortable with them, they get comfortable with you, and that's when actual collaboration starts happening, in my opinion.
Okay. So you're saying is first get to know the people, because people tend to be the first challenge. That's from your experience. So if we are trying to work with adjacent communities, number one is to learn their culture, learn their people, be open-minded. Okay.
That's right.
Who wants to speak next?
So I think from my perspective that the important thing that community to understand is that they need to understand what is that community is all about first. Because most of the time people are trying to do a lot of duplicate work and without understanding what is that other community is trying to do. So these sort of duplicate work, when come to a community level exposure, then it is really creating tension between the different communities. Okay, you are overlapping the work that I'm trying to do as well. I think very importantly, there are 3 layers of communication really need to happen from different communities. The layer 1 is the board. The different community boards should have a communication channel that they can talk each other in terms of what is the objective of the board is really about. So we have OpenStack Foundation, we have Linux Foundation, and there are other community as well. So that is very important because the executive level sync up is really important. The second item is that there is a technical committee, and a lot of technical decisions are made in the technical committee. And it is very important for a technical committee to really share the knowledge between the different communities to avoid the overlap because they see the bigger picture compared to an individual developer. The third part is really the developer themselves, the project themselves being actually engaged with other community. So we call this as a cross collaboration between the different communities, but it really need to happen on all the areas so that the communication between like the communities can happen. So the critical thing we need to establish is the communication first. If a communication is very good, then there will not be any problem between the communities and it will become more and more collaboration. So I will give an example. So AT&T have contributed Airship, which is in collaboration developed with SKT and Intel, and there is a majority of contribution from AT&T into it. It came with a collaboration, and in collaboration with the OpenStack Foundation, this code has been actually contributed to the OpenStack community. So it's really happening because of the collaboration. So we really need to bring in this sort of collaboration in the communities to really say, okay, here is how like we all work together and have a way of like operating. And a Crino project is also trying to do the same thing. Is that instead of duplicating the work, really looking at the landscape of different projects across the community and how do we really collaborate together. So last summit that we had like last week and the sessions that we had, we invited a lot of people from different communities. And even today in the Edge keynote, that's exactly what had happened. That OpenStack community is not just inviting the OpenStack community people, but also inviting people from other communities coming and sharing that knowledge, what is happening in other community. So I think to me, the communication is a key channel that allows the confusion to go away.
It's kind of interesting. I asked for challenges, but these gentlemen want to give me solutions right away. So I'm going to play devil's advocate here because I really want to get into the bottom of this, and then we can hopefully at the end of the panel we can have something to take back and really execute in the field in the communities. So what you're saying is definitely duplication project is not really good because we're all wasting our efforts, right? And then that creates unnecessary tension. But so you were saying is at the board level, the directors should talk to each other because board directors generally they come from a company's strategy team, right? And you talk about, okay, this is what my project is going to be doing, and then this is what we're trying to do, what you can do together. So you're saying the communication should happen at the top level first, and then you'll get, then the developers will execute. But my question to you is, sometimes when a project is proposed to a particular community, it's not well defined. They kind of wanted the project to grow organically. So in that case, it's really hard to define, the scope of the project. So how do you solve that problem?
Yeah, like I think for me, I think the measure of success in building an open source community is just kind of how diverse, healthy group of contributors it is, and it's a healthy, diverse group of contributors that really share a mission and kind of understand what the mission for their project is. And everything we talked about is super important. That kind of high-level executive view, that big picture, getting communities talking together, joint events, all of that. But in the end, for me, it comes down to the really pragmatic level of getting 1 or 2 or 3 people working on something tangible together, and from that, actual real collaboration growing and growing and growing. And I think that's why this is actually really quite difficult to do. And I've been part of many efforts to create projects like that, and that broader community never really comes together. You put a bunch of developers, say from Red Hat, working on a project, but somehow a broader community doesn't form around it. And definitely, it's most difficult to do when you start with a very, very large project and a very, very large code base, and open sourcing that and then trying to build a community around it. Usually it's more successful starting small and letting that grow organically, and letting it have a very kind of diverse growth and kind of mission.
Your proposal is bottom up, right?
Bottom up, but keeping in mind what the big picture is.
What the big picture is, great. Chris, who wants to address this?
So, if I step back a little bit, we talk about adjacent communities. And adjacent communities are generally then structures that we've created that are not within the bounds of the structure that we're discussing, right? So two different groups. Open source groups are inherently self-organizing. They're provided a scope, a frame, and then they run off and try to address the problem statement that they're there to deal with. When it comes to how to collaborate across borders between adjacent communities, I think to start with, the challenges that are inherent in that are that each of the communities is focused on a problem statement. And then there's a lot that bleeds off the edges of that. And what we find a lot is that what's bleeding off the edges is often addressed in a different community. And that's, I think, the sweet spot that we really want to address when we talk about how to work with adjacencies. It's how not to let that bleed build into something that costs a lot of time and effort for developers when it could be leveraged from another group. One of the things I see in the open infrastructure space at this point in time is that there is a conscious effort to work towards that and to address that. And that, I don't know, I haven't been in open source as long as some of these guys, but what I see in a lot of communities is it takes time to get to that point. When communities start, they're very much focused on their problem statement, they're very much focused on solving it in the way that they think is the right way to do it. And they don't necessarily raise their eyes to look at what else is out there and how else can we solve this problem. But as they mature, as the communities get stronger and as they're more confident in the fact that they have solved their problems, they have it under control, then they start to look at collaboration a little more. And you see OpenStack doing that today.
So you, Chris, you were very much involved in you had your leadership in the OpenNV community, and then OpenNV is very much connected with OpenStack. I also think of them as cousins. And from your experience, what worked well, what didn't work well that we can learn from?
OpenNV, it was an interesting initiative in that we intended not to try and solve other people's problems. We had essentially said we're going to take an upstream first approach. In other words, we didn't want to host code that belonged somewhere else. We just wanted to focus on the problem statement that was trying to make this technology relevant for the telecommunications market, which is where we began. So I think having a mindset that we don't solve everything here, we should be solving things in other places, was a really great way of making sure that we had those bridges open. But what you still find, even in a community that has such an approach, that there is a core set of activities which occur in the scope of that foundation's objectives that that group focuses on. So there was a lot of work on integration, testing, deployment solutions, heterogeneous architectures and verifying that they work. And that's still really the core of what OPNFV is focused on. Even if a lot of OPNFV development happens outside of OPNFV, you can see in OpenStack, if you look over the last 3 to 4 years, a lot of features have come through thanks to the OpenStack community for being adopting of these requirements, which are then, of course, consumed by the OPNFV.
Yeah, and I remember we had OpenStack and OpenMV joint board meetings a couple times, and I think that worked very well, that the two boards sat together and talk about where we need help on from each other and how we can, work together and, and then create solutions really the users can really use.
I think that is a missing piece today in pretty much in every board, including OpenStack board, is that we really need to bring in other board of directors. Some of us actually, I know that you have been involved in CNCF as well. Some of us is like from a company representation, we are not only representing one board, but also the other boards. But having the board representation, like cross-community board representation, allowing the other community board members to come and actually talk about the pain points and how do we really collaborate together, like the way you were explaining, I think that is very key because the development community can talk to each other, but if the board or the foundation level there is a tension, then it is very hard for the communities to be cohesively working together. So I think it is very important to have sort of like intercommunication in the board level, allowing the people to socialize it and have that collaboration going on would enhance whatever we already have, right? So I'm not saying that we don't have anything today. There is a lot of collaboration already happening between the cross community, but building this more is really through that all three layers that I talked about.
Kandan, but that's not how open source works, right? The TC and the board exists because of the people in the community that do the actual work, right? And it's not like the board tells the developers what to do or the TC tells the developers what to do either, right? So yes, it is important for the boards to talk to each other. Yes, it's important for the technical committee to talk to each other. But when the actual work gets done, when people who are actually carrying water, chopping wood, like they say in the Kubernetes Foundation, in the CNCF Foundation, that is when the rubber meets the road and things actually happen. So one example for that is in the Kubernetes space, there are a lot of, for example, like people from AWS, Azure, and all the different cloud providers that are out there, and the Kubernetes team, core team, actually said, look, we want to reduce the burden of you guys maintaining all your stuff. So you guys go figure out what is the best way for you all to collaborate with each other, right? So we ended up with a working group where people from the community who are maintaining all the different cloud providers, and then we decided how to strip out the code from the main Kubernetes repository, right? So yes, there is a mandate from the core team, but then we have to make it happen.
So I just want to comment on to that, James. That's why I said 3 layers, right? So the layer that you're talking about is the developers communicating among themselves. That is very important, and that's where the working group comes in. So we have the 2 more layers, that board and the foundation also talking together, because it's really, we need all these 3 layers, because today there is no working group between the boards or there is no working group between the foundation, right? So that is a missing piece, in my opinion, that need to come together.
Yeah, I totally agree that all are important, and if you were missing one of those, that's where problems would occur. So you mentioned, if there was tensions between particular foundations, that would affect everything down below. Totally agree. But I think maybe Dim is focusing on that lower layer just because of the very difficult challenges that there are there in actually making that kind of collaboration real. And I think sometimes we underestimate just the challenges of that human level interaction of making a community really work.
Yeah, so So I understand there's so many layers. They all have to talk, right? Boards have to talk, TCs have to talk, developers have to talk. What about users? And AT&T obviously is a user too. I personally, I think user can play a huge role in this because in the end of the day, what we're building is to serve the users. So I want to ask kind of what can users do, especially large users who have a lot of influence in the industry, to help with this kind of alignment? What kind of things that you guys can do to help?
We are already sort of doing it. If you look at the number of sessions that we had in past a few days and next to 2 days, so we had multiple session on Airship, and we had multiple session on OneApp, we had multiple session on Akraino, and we've been heavily participating on all the OpenStack session as well. So wherever it is possible in terms of bringing that cross-community knowledge, that AT&T team is already doing it. And we are really doing that in other community as well. So if there is a conference on like OneApp, there is a cross-community collaboration is happening there as well. From an AT&T perspective, we are invested in multiple open sources, and we really like to have, from a user, as you stated, from a user perspective, all this community coming together in all these layers and really providing a solution in an open source that can work together in a production deployment. We are really keen about that. And we are already doing that, and we are really expecting the community to do the same thing in other areas as well. So because community is about not just one company, it's about everybody coming together. And I feel that AT&T is already doing it, and other companies also doing it. We continuing to do this would actually really bring up like communities together in a more good way for a production quality code that we can take it from the open source and deploy.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have good metrics on user engagement, but it's really obvious that where you have a community where users are contributing, where users are part of that community, that community is obviously delivering value. It's delivering needed capabilities. That there is a space for everyone to collaborate, and to me that really is a really strong sign of a healthy community. You can see in OpenStack that there's been a transition to having more users of OpenStack on the board and more user engagement in the community. And to me, that's a really strong sign of a healthy and long-lived community. So making sure that when the users come, I remember when AT&Ts and others came to OpenStack the first time and started to talk about, we want to use it in this way, there was a lot of pushback. But over time, as we've learned more or less how to engage with each other and how to understand language and understand needs, now what we see is a thriving community that's able to address the growing and emerging needs of the open infrastructure mission. So I think that's really important. Making sure that occurs across communities, as AT&T is across a number of communities, and they're engaging in similar ways across these communities. That's the type of pull that open source communities really thrive on, I think.
I can tell you a story. So I spent a long time on just doing upstream stuff, which means work in Nova, Oslo, and just fix nitty-gritty problems and try to get the next release out as part of the release team. But then I shifted, based on Annie's feedback, we shifted our focus to see how are people using OpenStack? How is this being used in the community? What are the things people are using this for? Then I met a whole bunch of people I had never met before. There were people from Gopher Cloud, from a project called Gopher Cloud, who used to be at Rackspace, and then they took the code out into a new repository called Gopher Cloud. They are writing a Go-based SDK library for talking to OpenStack. And then I was talking to them about things, and they said, oh, we can't just do last 3 releases. We have to support a whole bunch of releases that is there in the environment, because they're already there and they're working and people are using it. So, and then I met people from SAP working on Cloud Foundry, and they said, Dims, we are having trouble getting new environments. So, and it's taking a lot more time for us to ship our releases, because new environments are hard to come by, and also we have to support older environments as well. And then we met people, operators in the Kubernetes community, who are actually coming together and writing code because they were using Kubernetes with OpenStack, and they had some code, but they were not even organized in the sense that They were doing things when they needed it, and they were doing fine. So I met a whole bunch of people who had some very unique ways of using OpenStack, and they were telling us basically what they wanted. What they wanted was they wanted backward compatibility, of course, and they wanted to be able to upgrade quickly. They wanted to be able to test pieces of code together, and for us to tell them which versions of different stuff works together. So all that stuff came up just because we shifted focus towards operators and end users, and actually trying to figure out what problems they have and what they are trying to solve.
Yeah, I love stories like that about how kind of diverse, again, a community could be. Like, so all these different users directly consuming, the open source projects, using them in so many different ways. And, AT&T is a great example of a user that makes the investment to directly use open source, directly contribute back to open source, and that's absolutely amazing. I think one thing that's kind of forgotten a little bit sometimes is the vendor's role in representing the interests of users that aren't directly involved with the open source project. And honestly, it's a responsibility that my team take very seriously. It's like we've hundreds of users and we have to listen to what they're telling us and kind of thoughtfully represent that in the project, and put aside the commercial aspect of that, right? There are customers, but just in terms of these are users trying to get value from open source technologies, and how do we make sure that their kind of feedback is kind of heard through us as contributors to the project.
Right. Yeah. Excellent. So I'd like to open up to the floor and see if you guys have any questions, and then we'll get back to the discussions again. Any question?
I can ask you a question.
Sure.
Which other communities do you want us to work with? What kind of things would you like working on OpenStack?
Good question.
Nope, no opinions. We're doing fine.
No. How about Apache? Apache. I mean, we don't hear too much about Apache here in this circle.
So I started in Apache back in 2001. So yeah, there is a lot of code from Apache that is being used, like for example Hadoop and MapReduce and Storm. There's so many things that are there, but they are all they can work on bare metal, they can work in virtual machines, they can work in containers. So basically, they don't play in the same space that we do, except for one project called Cloud Stack. So other than that, that's kind of disappeared as well because it came from a vendor, and the community didn't aggregate over it around it, and we ended up people coming here to OpenStack Foundation.
Hi, I've got a question for you.
What's your name? Sorry.
Oh, I'm Roz Roseborough from Heavy Reading. I'm an analyst as well. I spend a lot of time, as many of you know, looking at open source. And as I was sitting through the Edge keynotes this morning, it occurred to me that you've got lots of different projects all trying to define what the Edge is. And so I'm curious whether there is or should be some kind of process in place to make sure that there's alignment on what that problem space actually is. And whether you think it's important that you guys all define these things the same way.
Who wants to tackle that?
I know Skandan certainly will. I'll just take a quick stab at it. I mean, if you look at the theme of the conference, there's kind of two big major opportunities for open infrastructure here. It's the kind of hybrid cloud, kind of, an alternative, I guess, to the hegemony of like a few small public clouds. That's what I talked to my keynote. But obviously, the other big theme this week is edge computing, and that 5G rollout and the big massive amount of infrastructure investment that's going to happen here, and the role that open source is going to play in it. So I just see a huge amount of interest in capturing that opportunity and getting the collaboration happening. And so you see things like the OpenStack Edge Computing Working Group, Crano, OPNFV Edge Computing Working Group, and it's an Airship obviously, and Starling X, and there's so much happening there right now. I hope we figure out how to really get us all working together through all of that interest, because the interest is great.
That is going to be one of the goals of Akraino. That is going to be one of the goals of Akraino itself. And in terms of the edge definition, I will give you an example what happened in the OpenStack Edge Working Group. It almost took 3 months and almost 2 calls per week, and then it reduced to 1 call per week. And there were about 100 people on the call constantly on this three months thing, just talking about what is edge computing is, right? And defining the terminology, what is edge computing is. The one thing we realized is people like me, we come from a telco space, but we do address enterprise space. When we come to the community, we have a broad spectrum of people from a different industry coming in. So we see people from industrial IoT, we see people from enterprise who develop applications. When we have a different set of people coming into the community, that is the power of the community, we see a different context how they look at the problem. But it is right thing they are doing is that they're bringing a different perspective to the problem. So that is why, like we decided in the community to have a white paper. So I would encourage the people in the community to go to the OpenStack/edge computing. And there is a white paper that has been written by community, and that actually talks about what does edge computing really mean. That came out of that 3 months of, like whole discussion of hundreds of people defining what that edge computing is. And there are other white papers as well. AT&T, we published a white paper, and other people have also published a white paper. And from Akraino, currently, like we have discussed this in the 2-day summit in Portland. And one of the intention is that to define more context around the different project, how do we work together, and what are the use cases that we would address into it. That we're also defining the edge computing definition more in detail. So definitely there are materials actually out there in the community, but more work is needed to really bring the people jump-started in the terminologies for sure.
I'm going to answer the question related to adjacent communities. I've been, as some of you may know, just humming around Edge now for quite some time. Where that's taken me, it's been an interesting journey. I've spent a lot of time with the Eclipse Foundation discussing Edge. I've spent a lot of time in the Linux Foundation and the OpenStack Foundation talking about Edge. I've been speaking with a lot of vendors and operators who aren't engaged in any of those communities around Edge. We've been looking at some of what the large companies are doing, the Googles and the Amazons and those, and how that comes into Edge. I think the conclusion that I have coming out of the last year or so is that you won't define Edge in OpenStack, you won't define Edge in Linux Foundation, you won't define Edge in any one place. Edge will emerge. What we need to do as an open source community, or as a collection of open source communities, is make sure that we work together across these boundaries and make sure that as these variations of what Edge is going to be and as these different deployment types emerge, that we have a solution and an answer for that allows the mission of open source and open collaboration to fill that space and drive that technology forwards. Yeah.
Well, first of all, I want to acknowledge that was an excellent question, and I'm sure a lot of people are thinking about that too. You might sound like, now everybody's talking about Edge, and then a while ago everybody's talking about containers, and then now later people are going to talk about AI, and then 5G readiness, right? And all these big things, movements are happening in our industry. I think in a way it's good to have all these different voices, different ideas coming up, because people come to this kind of conference, open source community, for inspiration, for innovation, ideas, and we should all keep an open mind. And eventually something is going to emerge as a de facto standard. That's what I think. And it's not just open source, it's also, adjacent industries as well, like who, will also contribute. I want to bring to a more of a practical level. So it's.
I was going to go there.
Yeah, can I finish? Well, yeah. Since I'm the moderator. so I want to take it to down level to something that we can really take back to the community and really execute on. And, you guys talk about white paper. That's great because that shows leadership, shows vision and all that. And I really personally, I like, the open dev meetings. These are great for people to come together to brainstorm. And then once ideas come out, and then codes were generated, and we need to make sure that we certify not certify. We put them together, test them. So open lab. we came up with the Open Lab program, right? It's a program where we, rally up all these community members, companies to come and donate resources, physical, virtual, and developer, and tester resources together, and then we put things together and test them, see how they work. And I think that part is also very important. So I just wanted to put my plug in there, Open Lab. And Dims?
So, white paper is great. Now, what do we do next? I remember asking Chris the same question. How do we translate the requirements that is coming in, that is being gathered in these discussions, to either the existing projects or trying to set up new projects to fulfill some of these roles? For example, there was a session yesterday where we were talking about, okay, we use messaging. It's called Oslo messaging. How do we make sure that Oslo messaging can work in the edge environments? So that was one session. The other session we were talking about was, how do we, what are the things that we can do in Keystone to support the edge use cases? So it is becoming real now. I mean, I was trying to push, Chris 6 months ago saying, okay, we need to do that now, and it's happening now. And seeing that, I'm very happy, Chris. So I'm glad that things are coming to the point where it's being actually turned into a discussion with the existing project members, existing people in different projects, and maybe we'll find that there are new projects that we need to start, and we'll find people to work on it.
Oh, we have a question from the audience.
Thank you. I'm Amy Wheelis from AT&T. To build on some of the things y'all have been saying and kind of piece it together from my perspective, from an OpenStack perspective, is, we're here, the whole theme of this conference, this summit, is open infrastructure. And I think that from our perspective, and Condon said this, the projects and the organizations need to stay true or focus on what is their focus and what are their roles. I think one of the things we've got to be very focused on, and I would like y'all's view on this, is, as an open infrastructure, what are those requirements that we need to meet, but how do we go provide those requirements so no matter what the workloads are that we need to support on our infrastructure, we are supporting them, and we're providing the security and the quality assurance that you were talking about from an Open Lab perspective. How do we make sure that we don't lose focus because there's a new shiny toy, and we go chase that new shiny toy and don't underpin what we're doing with the things that's needed that'll be even more important? If you think edge, things like security are even more important when you have thousands of deployments as opposed to tens of deployments and things like that.
Exactly. Build on the strengths you have, right? That's exactly right. And to be honest, a lot of those comments you made are reflected in the conversations Dims was referring to. There was a lot of conversation yesterday on image management and how it works at the edge and how it works in different security contexts, and Keystone for security, and all of these topics are starting to come through, and the white paper and general conversation and cross-collaboration, the Ukraino workshop coupled with the OpenStack conference, have essentially incubated these conversations and exposing those requirements in a meaningful way. It's important then that OpenStack, of course, remains focused on that open infrastructure piece, on solving the problems that are relevant to what we're solving here. And then, of course, adjacent communities, collaborating with those adjacent communities to fill in the gaps and essentially come up with that solution space.
Yeah, one thing I've been thinking about a lot is just how to really have the open source community, or the OpenStack community in general, embrace the edge use case in kind of a deep way in their thinking. And I think, I've been thinking about how that went for the initial kind of core network and FEI use case. And that was kind of easier in the sense of you could, save OpenStack developers thinking in terms of using OpenStack to build a public cloud or build a private cloud. An NFEI implementation then was essentially just like that, but with some kind of rather specialized workloads with some rather specialized requirements. Whereas when you talk about edge deployments, it's a really different deployment architecture, and I'm not sure yet that's really sunk in with a lot of people in the OpenStack community. So, for example, in an edge deployment, the workloads are probably a bit more constrained or predefined. You're not talking about an infrastructure operator allowing multiple tenants to come into work and deploying this environment. But that's not kind of a context that I think OpenStack developers in general think about yet. And so how do we crystallize that? How do we get it started? And I think back to the very early days of the NFV work we did, say one of the early requirements was, how do I pin this CPU, or how do I pin this VM to CPU 1? That might have gone, that conversation probably went on a year before we ended up with like flavors which express the requirement to have for a VM to have dedicated CPUs and for the abstraction to make sense there. And from that, everything kind of grew in terms of the OpenStack community embracing the idea of NFV. How do we do the same thing for Edge?
Okay, anyone else?
I think this is a great question that Amy's brought up because her team manages the large deployment in a production. I think the point that she is trying to stress on, which I totally agree, is really on the existing tool set, existing OpenStack, that deployment is currently in production. And if there are security issues, if there are critical issues from a user perspective, how do we solve that in the OpenStack community, right? So before we talk about other communities, how do we solve that in the OpenStack communities? There are a couple of initiatives that OpenStack community have taken, especially the product working group and the user working group, and taking that feedback and implementing that into the community. That is a one good initiative. But I think we need to continue that in a larger scale to really allow people who are already deployed and facing problems like, for example, security issues, and especially if it is in a network, in the scale of that AT&T is deploying, you can't really wait for 3 months or 6 months to really have that fixes, like done, right? So it has to, so we do need to have the community to focus on some of the areas of, like security, and that's where the user feedback comes in, right? Having that channel, like continue and even to enhance it would support user experience actually better on the product that has already been shipped and already been in production.
I can add to that a little bit. Amy, we would really love your team to come and help us with the stable branch maintenance. I already asked these two guys. No, I'm asking you directly. So
Recorded.
we are actually bending over backwards to try to figure out a policy that would work for everybody, especially for people who are maintaining internal versions of OpenStack for their, like Kandan said, we need a security fix. We need to do it fast. We need like a performance issue. We are rolling out DirecTV, so there is a network thing that we need to fix. Yes? So we need the people who are working in the downstream teams from different companies to collaborate in the stable branch process. That is where you can trade the patches. And what we did to support that case is we are allowing the stable branches to be there for a really long time. But now we are actively recruiting people to say, OK, the downstream team that is working on this stuff, please come here and do this work for us. So we've rolled out the model from with other teams like Cinder drivers and things like that. But we want to do this for all the core projects that are out there for OpenStack, and we would really love your help. Thank you.
And that's on recording too.
Yes, thank you.
Put me on the spot now. But just to add to that and come back to the user perspective, what's really important when it comes to things like long-term maintenance is to know whether a fix or shift strategy should be taken for any particular problem statement. And the developers working in the code will always choose fix. But it may be that from an ops perspective, shift is a better approach, and rather than trying to solve it in this version, we should probably try and do a fast-forward upgrade or something like that. And those judgment calls are really important to come from users of the software. So having users engaged in long-term stable is going to be very important.
It's going to be absolutely crucial because we've seen people still use really old OpenStacks, and they are patching features backwards. They are, taking bug fixes backwards and things like that too. And vendors have to do the same as well. Like, the people working at Red Hat, people working at Ubuntu.
Now apologize to Annie for going off topic.
Sorry. It's adjacent open source community collaboration. There are people working in downstream everywhere, and I'm asking them to come here.
We are reaching almost the end of our session now. I do want to ask a parting question. So what do you think the number one success factor for community collaboration, collaboration with adjacent community. I'm going to give you some time to think, but I'll give you my take on this. I think the number one thing is it doesn't matter which community you're registered under. Well, open source community, we are one big community. And at the end of the day, the reason we innovate, the reason we create is to serve our users. So if we always put users up front and then just work together, I think with that kind of mentality, I think it'll be a lot easier to work with everyone in the open source community. Who wants to go next?
I think for me, the big kind of measure of success of an open source project clearly is what it's producing and the impact it's making. But in terms of looking at one community and judging it healthy or successful versus another, it's really whether someone can come along with the willingness and the intent and the desire to make a difference in that project and drive it in a certain direction. The ability for that project kind of to empower that person and get out of that person's way and let that person make a difference, as opposed to I think many times projects can be very, very, very difficult to kind of get involved with, and I think that's a real challenge that OpenStack is trying to tackle now. How to really empower more people to come and join the project and make a difference.
So I'm going to repeat what I said in the beginning of this conversation. I think the cross-community communication is very critical to build this, better collaboration between the communities.
I would just say be kind, be welcoming. Just like you are going into another community to do some little bit of work there, there are other people coming into your community, so treat them like you would like to be treated. So, and be open, be kind, listen to everybody, and I think that's what you need to do.
Looks like you're talking from some past experience.
Yes, absolutely.
I can add, I would say do exactly what Dims has done, and that is look for ways to solve common problems with others, and do so the way he described. I mean, don't try and solve it yourself. Look for others to help and work together on the problem. That's
excellent. Thank you so much. That concludes our panel. Thank you very much, audience, for your time. Have a great rest of the conference.
Thank you.
Thank you.